Now, this may all be sounding very simple. Of course, the challenge is to put it into practice, particularly where we have situations where risk or uncertainty is inherently qualitative and we need to turn it into something quantitative. We need to turn it into numbers. And so maybe, Bruno, for a minute, we talk about that, because there's a number of markets in which risk can't be quantified. What are some examples of how people try to bridge between the theory and practice of corporate finance in the way that qualitative risks somehow have a measure of basis points or dollars and cents?
Sure. So you're right. Some risks can actually be measured, and typically you measure the impact that a certain risk has on the rate of return in terms of percentage points or basis points. 1 basis point is really a percent of a percent. So 100 basis points is a percent.
And this would be going down the road of some kind of sensitivity analysis where I change the input and I see what the output, how the output measure changes.
Right. There are really many ways that you can do that. One way is if you're looking at it purely, let's say you're an investor and you're looking at the market. Let's say you're a credit investor, which is what I happen to know best, and is also the easiest, because as a credit investor, you will get, if you buy corporate debt, you will get a spread, what we call a credit spread, over the risk-free rate, which is really essentially telling you exactly the value of that risk, if you like. So I can buy a treasury bond and get, maybe 3% in the United States now, 3.25 if I buy a 10-year bond, and I can buy a 10-year corporate bond, and this will pay me, let's call it maybe 5%. So I know that I get 1.75% return extra, and that's really to quantify for the risk. In the equity space, it's a little bit different. People look at betas. Betas being a measure of the covariance between the volatility of a stock, the covariance between a single stock and the market, right? And so if you know the market risk premium, which is something that typically you can measure looking at the market, and the beta of a stock, you can get as well an idea of how much is the risk premium. So that's really if you're looking at how those stakes, if you like, are traded in the market. If you look at a project, and ultimately all these things have to tie in together. If you look at a project, you're right, you can look at the variability of the cash flows, for example. So you talked about calculating an NPV by drawing the cash flows, finding what is the appropriate discount rate and calculating an NPV. But you also talked about the fact that those cash flows rely on some assumptions. Right? So if you change the inflation rate, if you change the volume, if you change the prices, if you change the growth rate, all of these things impact the cash flows and therefore in turn impact the NPV.
And of course there's things that are going to be quantitative in the sense, as you mentioned, credit, which is a great example, but there's a lot more challenging aspects when I'm looking at real assets and I'm trying to find out how should I translate the risk of not being able to evacuate the power onto the grid at any given moment in the day. How do I translate that into the basis points of return? That's an almost impossible task.
It's incredibly hard, and a lot of people are trying to look into that. So typically when you prepare a project, you don't look at a single NPV. You do a sensitivity analysis. It's essentially a bunch of what-if scenarios and say, how does my NPV look like in a worst-case scenario maybe, or in a middle-case scenario, in a blue sky scenario. A potentially more complicated way of doing this, maybe more sophisticated, is to use stochastic cash flow modeling, where every driver of risk, driver of variability has essentially a random process, and then you draw on simulations on that, and then you essentially have a distribution of NPVs. That's another way of doing that.
So when we think about the theory of investment decision making, it's really not as complex as it might seem at first blush. But putting theory into practice, well, that's now another matter altogether. Hopefully we can provide, as we go through this course, some ways of thinking about investments and learning the language of finance. Because it's actually not so much of the engineering, it's not about building buildings, there's not a lot of really complex equations. A lot of it's just pure common sense, but relies upon a sense of language and a way of speaking that might be familiar or unfamiliar to some people. And so those are the competencies we're trying to build here in order to dig deeper into what is this opportunity around investments and how does that complement potentially a corporate renewable procurement program.